Again, I'd like to welcome the opportunity to make a brief contribution to this debate, and I'd like to thank Liam MacArthur and his team for giving us an opportunity to bring it before Parliament today. Deputy Presiding Officer is a Highlander whose first job was in Dumfries, and I have to confess I was once a fresh-faced councillor in my 20s. I'm well aware of the effect of... thank you for the secondary position, I appreciate that comment. I'm well aware of the disproportionate effect of high fuel prices have in rural communities, be it the haulier from Lerwick or the pensioner from Lossiemouth. But I'd like to start, Deputy Presiding Officer, with a slight health warning that, of course, rural areas are not one easily packaged, uniform area across Scotland. And to be fair, the Scottish Government recognises this in its classification system from urban, accessible rural to remote rural. So, of course, there's a world of difference between Inverness and Ardnamurchan and Dumfries and Eskilmuir. I'd like to touch briefly on the work carried out by the Enterprise and Lifelong Learning Committee report from 2001, which looked into fuel prices, and also very briefly into the Oftel and the ECOS reports, which date from the same era. And perhaps I could make just passing reference, of course, to the EU context, which is very important, which is namely Article 19 of the Energy Products Directive. So, as some members have already touched on, Deputy Presiding Officer, what determines the price of fuel in our rural filling stations? And the committee looked at this in some detail in 2001. Well, of course, as we all know, it's the elements of duty and VAT. Of course, it's the elements of the upstream. For example, the cost of extraction and refining, the downstream, the retail aspects. And of course, as members such as Lewis MacDonald have pointed out, the price of crude on the spot market in Amsterdam. And of course, there's also the other techie issue of the relative exchange rates between the pound and the dollar, because obviously fuel's quoted in dollars. In addition, Deputy Presiding Officer, individual petrol stations operate individual agreements with suppliers. So we have discounts, we have rebates, we have price support. And as a very general rule, prices in larger towns and rural areas, such as Dumfries and Elgin, for example, are the same within a few pence of the cities such as Glasgow and Edinburgh. Well, why? Well, because suppliers provide price support. But lower volume rural sites with standalone petrol stations with no immediate competition will have no price support and will have a higher retailer markup because, of course, volumes are lower. This will lead to the higher price. And for the technocrats among you, there's a really good worked example of this in Appendix A of the Oftel report in July 2000. Obviously, the prices are different, but the underlying logic is exactly the same. And of course, as members have pointed out earlier, this effect is amplified in our super-rural and our island communities. Now, this motion, Deputy Presiding Officer, focuses on reserved issues and the EU derogations on fuel duty. But surely, I think, as Lewis MacDonald mentioned, surely the emphasis should be on what this Parliament can do to promote social inclusion, economic development and community cohesion in Scotland, particularly in our remote rural and island communities. When this proposed rural fuel duty derogation was debated in Westminster, a whole series of questions were raised, and perhaps Mr Stone, when he is winding up, can address some of these issues. For example, what is the qualifying criteria for retail outlets? What guarantees will there be that the fuel duty reduction will be passed on to the customer? Now, Danny Alexander MP quoted a cost of £35 million for this. Could I just finish this point? Is this to be a new Liberal Democratic spending commitment? And I'll give way to the member.
Alistair Allen.
I thank the member for giving way. The member outlines some of the pressures on rural fuel prices. Does he feel that Greece or France, for instance, or Portugal are wrong to see that the fuel duty system, that the pricing system as far as tax goes, are they wrong to see it as being relevant? Are they wrong to see it as something that needs to be adjusted in rural areas?
Deputy President, I'm glad the members raised that point, because I'll touch on the EU section just in a few seconds, and that will answer the member's point. How does leakages across the border between urban and rural work? Who's going to qualify? Is it domestic, business or tourism? And I think, in conclusion, Deputy President, I see my time is rushing out. There is, of course, other proposals that happened for rural motorists. I would flag up the last administration's work in the Rural Transport Fund. I would flag up the work done for rate relief for rural petrol stations and, of course, the UK Government's derogation on EU petrol vapour recovery. But in conclusion, Presiding Officer, I'm in no doubt that fuel prices are a major burden, particularly remote, rural and island communities. There is no, however, magic bullet. We need to develop new public transport solutions, which of course are good for climate change. We must support existing petrol stations. We must look at the Scandinavian model of unmanned stations. We must look at cooperative buying, as the Highland Council have done, over fishing. We must pass on the savings, of course, done to our motorists. And finally, we must pursue having a rural summit of petrol retailers. All these issues will contribute to sustaining our rural communities. Thank you.